Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Let's Talk Fantasy Football. I'm your host for tonight. My name is Nick Walsh, and I'm here by myself actually tonight, doing a podcast a little bit different than what we normally do, where I will be talking about a daily fantasy specific strategy rather than typical league based fantasy football. So if you don't play daily fantasy, you don't have to listen. I think it helps. I think playing daily fantasy helps you in your league or your yearly leagues as well. Just the mindset that you have to take. So it's up to you there, but I think there's going to be some good information here and definitely some stuff that can help you out or and maybe make you think about things differently. Whether you currently play daily or you don't, and if you don't, but you want to give it a shot, I think it'll be a great primer here to let you guys know, um, basically how you can get started and what kind of strategies you can use from the beginning. I apologize if I'm talking a little bit quieter. I sound a little less enthusiastic. It is currently almost 2 a.m. here on the West Coast, 2 a.m. Pacific time. I am staying up because I have an early morning flight to Denver to do a fantasy draft and meet up with my good buddies who also do the podcasts here. And we're all going to be hanging out and doing a draft this weekend, which should be tons of fun. But I hate being on planes, so my normal strategy is to get myself as tired as possible, and then take some medication to knock me out, and go from there. So that's what I'm doing. I'm up in the middle of the night. I'm speaking a little quietly because I don't want to wake up my roommate, who is sleeping down the hall. So yeah, we'll get going from here, guys. I do want to let you guys know the that Let's Talk Fantasy Football is sponsored by No Halftime. The No Halftime app isn't your typical fantasy sports service. You get to create one-on-one fantasy matchups, and you can use the code LTFF for a free sign-up bonus there. So as I said, guys, I'm going to talk about some daily fantasy sports. I'm going to go through the basics, some tips in terms of bankroll management, how you want to be spending your money, as you go through this, and then some strategy for the different types of games, because there are several different types of games that you can play on daily fantasy sites, as well as some strategies for the specific positions and what to look for going forward. So, guys, the first thing I'm going to talk about is just basically the basics of daily fantasy or DFS. The idea, if you're not aware at this point, is the site sets a salary cap. Each player has a price, and you need to fill a roster within that salary cap. You're obviously trying to score fantasy points with that roster based on the specific settings for for that site rather. The two major sites that people play on are DraftKings and FanDuel, though there are plenty of smaller ones out there that are also a lot of fun. But for the purposes of this, I'm going to talk mostly about DraftKings and FanDuel. So there are some differences with those. DraftKings has full PPR scoring. They have yardage bonuses, which can play a factor in, guys having big games and putting up a lot of points. There's no kicker in the lineup, though they do have a flex spot in addition to three wide receivers. And an interesting spot there is they have late swap. So what late swap is basically it late swap allows you to swap out players whose games haven't started yet, even if the contest has already started. So that would be like a guy in a night game, on the regular, on the regular slate. So say it's 4 o'clock. You want to swap out a guy on in the night game. Some news came out. You can do that on DraftKings, whereas on FanDuel you cannot do that. So FanDuel, unlike DraftKings, has a half point PPR, which makes it a little bit less predictable and a little bit lower scoring. Touchdowns are definitely a huge deal in tournaments on FanDuel. No yardage bonuses. So again, big games oftentimes do come from multi-touchdown games rather than just huge amounts of yards or huge amounts of catches. As I said before, the lineups lock. at the time the contest starts. So if you're playing a Thursday night contest, it's going to lock on Thursday night. You won't be able to adjust your lineup after that point. And FanDuel also has no flex. It's two running backs, three wide receivers, tight end, defense, kicker. Kicker can bring some interesting strategy in there, but I'll go through that as we continue. So there are several different types of games with different payout structures, and the strategy that you take to building your lineup is going to depend a lot on those different payout structures. Um, the first type of game is, well, you'll see I kind of break it down a little bit further than I guess most people do, but it's normally people will refer to them as cash games, and then the other kind is tournaments or GPPs. But for cash games, I think there's a distinction that a lot of people they lump in head-to-head plays when 50-50s and double ups all together. But I think there's a little bit of different strategy that ideally should be going into all these. So 50-50s, as the name kind of implies, you have to finish in the top half in order to win money. And the site takes their rake. They take their 10% of each dollar. So if you do win, you make 1.8 times your entry fee. So if I enter a $1 50-50, I finish in the top half, I am making $1.80. In order to break even with the sites taking what they do, you need to end up winning a little bit over 55% of those games. So if you're winning under that, you're going to be losing money. If you're winning over that, you're going to be making some money on those. With double ups, it's a similar concept, only the rather than taking the rake from the site out of what you're given, you do double up your money in this one. So instead of receiving the 1.8 times, you receive full 2 times your entry fee. But you actually have to end up finishing in, at least in like the big ones early in the year, the number is about 43, the top like 43.5% there. So you gotta finish a little bit higher in order to cash. But when you do cash, you receive the full double your money. So you get $2 on a $1, $20 on a $10 rather entry fee. So those they have their specific strategy, and there are a lot of opportunities to play those. But the other kind of cash game is a head-to-head, where you just play one person, and if you beat that person, you get 1.8 times the entry fee. So it's there's a little bit more variance in there. But if you play a lot of head-to-heads each week, you're generally going to come out to around how good you really are, how good your lineups really are with your win rate there. If you're playing 2 head-to-heads each week, it's likely that you could get lucky or unlucky a lot on a weekly basis. But if you're playing closer to 50 head-to-heads or 100 head-to-heads or that sort of thing each week, you're likely going to see closer to your actual win rate, or closer to what your win rate should be with those head-to-heads. So the other basic or general type of game structure are called tournaments, or GPPs. They're often referred to, which stands for Guaranteed Prize Pool. These tournaments, they pay out normally somewhere from like 18% to 25% of the field. And first place receives a large payout. They decrease in size down from there. So unlike in the cash games where first place in a 50-50, in a 100-person 50-50, gets the same amount of money as 49th place. There's a big benefit to winning a tournament rather than just finishing in the top half. It's a huge amount of money compared to your entrance fee. And also, if a tournament's paying out 20% of the field, if you have, if your lineup is in that 21st percent, you're making the same amount of money as the guy whose lineup is in the 99th percent. And that's $0. You're not making any money. So there's a very, very much a different strategy that goes into building tournament lineups from those cash game lineups. And I'm going to get into that in a little bit. First, though, I do want to talk about the the amount of money that you're putting in, because you can play free games on daily fantasy sites, but a lot of the appeal is you can win money, and potentially a lot of money if you're good at it. Um, the way you manage that money, it's based on your priorities and what you're good at. So by your priorities, I mean, like, what are you trying to accomplish with daily fantasy? Are you trying to grind out a profit each week, make a little bit of money, end up maybe doubling your money throughout the season if you grind out some nice profits each week? Like, is that your priority? Is that what you're looking to do? Or are you just looking to get um, a little bit of a sweat each week? You're just trying to get a little bit of action on the games, make them a little bit more fun, which is definitely, it can be just seen as an entertainment cost. Put a couple lineups in, the $3 tournament. You're not spending much money, but now you're having a little bit more fun watching football. It's really depends a lot on what you're looking for specifically, and what you're trying to get, out of daily fantasy. Um, in terms of what you're good at, I mean, some people are better at cash games. Cash games are really more about projecting player performance than anything else. If you can project players better than the people you're playing against, you're likely going to make some money there. Whereas tournaments, there's a little bit more contrarian thinking and sort of game theory that goes into this. So maybe you're a very, very good cash player, you're great at projecting, but you're not spectacular at tournaments, then you would probably want to play a higher percentage of cash games. If you're one of those people whose brain just kind of works in the tournament way, where you're a little outside of the box with your strategies, then maybe you want to play a higher percentage of tournaments. It's really up to you and what you think you're good at, and then again, what your priorities are, what you're trying to get out of daily fantasy. Personally, myself, I'm going to start out pretty tournament heavy for myself early in the year, because um, as the season goes on, we start to be able to project better because we have more data on these teams. Once we have the data and we know by week 11 that this team's pass defense is bad, this team's O line is good, that sort of thing, it becomes much easier to project games and player performance than it is in week one, when we don't even really know roles in some cases. So it's I'm going to start out a little bit more tournament heavy and try and embrace sort of the variance that does come out earlier in the season. I'll probably be around 30% of the money I'm putting in will be in tournaments, and then I'm going to like decrease that a little bit each week, until I'm kind of, by the end of the year, probably down to somewhere like 85-15, or 90% to 10% in terms of that ratio of cash games to tournaments. So that's kind of what I'm doing. You definitely don't have to do that if you don't think it's good, or if you think you're a different kind of player. I completely understand, but that's what I'm starting with. Um, all right, so the next thing I want to talk about, guys, is basic cash game strategy. Uh, and so this is where I said I think it's important to make a distinction between 50-50s and double ups, and then head to heads, because they're often lumped together. And I don't think the optimal strategy for each of them should be the same. People will refer to your cash game lineup as the one you put in head to heads and 50-50s. Um, I don't think that's necessarily correct, because they are different, and I'm going to go through that here. So for 50-50s and double ups, there's no benefit to being number one compared to in a 100-person 50-50 number 50. If you're number 50, you get the same amount of money as number one. So what you're trying to do is build a team with a very high floor. Take a lot of guys who are safe players. You can project for them to have a certain floor. Obviously injuries and whatever sort of happen, and you can't really avoid that. But you don't need to go out of your way to target ceilings. You just want to target guys who have high floors and a good, sort of average projection in your mind. I'll definitely sacrifice ceilings or potentially higher projections to fit in someone who I think is safer. So the best example of that I could really think of is I'll often avoid game script dependent running backs in these 50-50s because there's a chance each week that they're just going to be completely not used. So, say someone, Adrian Peterson is a guy who's burned me a little bit in the past um, in games where I thought he had a very high projection and I thought the Vikings were going to win. And then they didn't, and they got down big early. And Adrian Peterson doesn't really get a ton of work in the pass game, and his floor wasn't as high as I thought it was, and that's a situation where um, I'll still project him very highly, but I'll try and maybe go for a running back who, if the team were to get down early, is still going to be at least a little bit involved in that pass game and still has the potential to get a decent amount of work if the team abandons the run, as teams tend to do when they fall down early. So that's sort of an example there. And I think that's the main difference between 50-50s and head-to-heads. Because in heads-to-heads, I'm just looking to play my highest projected lineup. Um, it makes sense to allow for some risk because there's a benefit to having greater than a 50th percentile lineup. Um, if I have a 95th percentile lineup in head-to-heads, I'm probably going to win 95% of my head-to-heads, which is more money than if I have that 50th percentile 50th percentile lineup. I'm only going to win 50% of my head-to-heads with the rake from the site, where I'm getting 1.8 return on my entrance fee. I won't even make a profit if I'm winning 50% there. So the goal in those 50-50s is to get to that 50%, beat half the field. In head-to-heads, if I'm beating half the field, I'm losing money. So I need to be trying to make the best lineup that I possibly can. So I'll take a little bit of risk. I'll play Adrian Peterson in a game where I'm projecting him highly. Even if there's a chance that if they get down big, he won't do well, because there's a benefit to me having a 75th percentile lineup, an 80th percentile lineup. And if the risk doesn't work out, and say I have a 40th percentile lineup, I win 40% of my head-to-heads. Well, I can kind of make that up next week. It doesn't necessarily have to be like I need to hit a certain number each week. I need to get 60% of my head-to-heads each week. As long as it averages out to 60% at the end of the year, it's the same amount of money. So that's sort of the way I look at head-to-heads. I think that you should be allowing for some upside, and using your highest projected lineup rather than sacrificing ceilings or projections for safety. All right, guys. So I'm going to take a quick break here. You'll hear from our sponsor, No Halftime. I'll be back to talk tournament strategy, which is very interesting to me, and then position-specific strategy. All right, welcome back, guys. That was our sponsor, No Halftime. I'm going to go ahead and jump back into the daily fantasy talk with some strategy for tournaments or GPPs, whatever you want to call them. I don't really care. So obviously, when you're entering a tournament, like for example, the Millionaire Maker on DraftKings, your goal, cashing would be nice, sure, but your goal there is to finish first. There's a extreme monetary benefit to finishing first, rather than being in the top 100 or that sort of thing. Those are all nice consolation prizes, but it's you want to put in a lineup that has, in your eyes, a reasonable chance of finishing first if certain things go your way. If you finish with, like I said, if you finish in the 21st percent, compared to the, or, compared to the 99th, it's the same result. You're getting no money. So that's you should be willing to take more risks. You should be willing to prioritize ceilings in your lineups rather than floors. And you should be looking to separate yourself from the field in terms of your lineup construction and your players. So one of the things that's I think difficult for new daily fantasy players to grasp a lot of the time is why exactly ownership matters in tournaments in daily fantasy. And the reason ownership matters, I'll try and explain it as best as I can, is you're trying to beat the field. You're not trying to maximize your points scored. And I know, you might be thinking, well, the way I beat the field is by maximizing my points scored, but it's not necessarily true. And the reason for that is because our projections are not always correct. If our projections were correct all the time, I would be getting, or for like if my projections were correct 100% of the time, I could just get rich off cash games and like that would be fine. But they're not. So you play tournaments in order to basically say, well, what if some of my projections don't work out, or what if some of what the crowd thinks isn't actually what's going to happen? How can I benefit from that? How can I benefit from the natural variance in football? So going back to that idea of beating the field, not maximizing your points scored. If I scored 290 points, but someone else scored 291, I didn't win. I didn't beat the field. I didn't do what I was trying to do. But if I scored 200 points and no one else scored more than 199, I won. So I scored 90 less points, but I actually accomplished my goal. So the way that relates to all of this is the idea that if a guy who's projected highly by most people, he's going to be highly owned. Uh, there's a benefit to not playing that person, even if they're the highest projected, because things like injuries and bad games, they happen. Our projections aren't perfect. So if the unexpected happens, you're benefiting from that rather than being hurt by it. If Todd Gurley is 40% owned this week, and I sat him, if he gets hurt in the first quarter, 40% of the field, I'm automatically ahead of in terms of the reasonable ability to win a tournament. Because if you have a guy get a 0, you're probably not going to win a tournament. It's possible. It's not likely. So if Gurley, if Gurley gets hurt, or if the Rams get down really early, if Gurley gets mad, punches someone, gets ejected, all of a sudden I'm ahead of 40% of the field. And that's not to say that that you need to take Gurley out of every single lineup if you think he's going to be highly owned. But you shouldn't be playing him in 100% of your lineups if he's going to be 40% owned, because there's situations where if he does poorly, you're going to be very hurt. I mean, you'd be very hurt by that. You'd basically be drawing dead if Todd Gurley does poorly. And at 40% owned, if you don't play him, you're putting yourself ahead of 40% of the field. I don't think it's necessary, and the numbers have shown it's not necessary to go completely off the wall with your teams. Like every guy that you're playing is 5% owner, 5% owned or below. And you don't have to completely not play a player. If you're playing multiple lineups, the guys who are going to be the highest owned are highest owned for a reason, and it's because they're good plays that week. So you don't need to, not play him in every single lineup just because a guy's going to be high owned. But you do need to make sure you're making your lineup different from the field in some sort of way. So it's very important, to go in. One way to look at it is like you have a core of players and maybe you cycle in a couple lower owned players, just kind of sub them out, because it's okay to have high owned players. You can win tournaments with high owned players, but it's very unlikely for you to do it with a team of completely high owned players. So that's sort of the idea there. And if you're listening to this and thinking, well, I have no idea what the public's on, you can get a good idea of it throughout the week by reading articles, listening to experts, and then a big one is, I said before, FanDuel has their Thursday contest. They lock on Thursday. That means you can see the ownership for all the players in those contests. So if you look at that, you can probably get a decent idea of what the ownership is going to look like during the Sunday contest as well. And that can definitely help you out. Other strategies in tournaments or other things you want to do, you should be using players with high touchdown potential, particularly on FanDuel because they don't have the yardage bonuses or the full point PPR. Touchdowns are hugely important. So if a guy doesn't get a ton of red zone targets, you think he's going to have a good game, but he doesn't get a ton of red zone targets. He doesn't break big plays. Maybe he's not the best tournament play. Or maybe you should save him for DraftKings, where, it's possible that he gets a yardage bonus or, the full point PPR buoys the production. But generally, you want to try and target touchdown potential. You also want to take advantage of correlations. So when a quarterback throws a touchdown to his wide receiver, the quarterback gets 4 points, the wide receiver gets 6 points. The wide receiver gets a point for the reception, and they both get points for the yards. That's a positive correlation. That's something you can take advantage of. In some cases, entire teams, it can be smart to not entire, but a quarterback, a wide receiver, and a running back. If that team really goes nuts that week, it's likely there's going to be enough touchdowns for all of them. And that's the kind of thing that can really differentiate you a little bit. Like a lot of people will use the quarterback and the wide receiver. Not everyone's going to use the quarterback, the wide receiver, and the running back, or the quarterback, the wide receiver, and the tight end. So there's a lot of things you can do there to take advantage of just natural correlations that happen in football. In terms of getting those contrarian lineups, a couple of things that you can do as well is just construct your lineup differently than what most of the crowd is doing. So if most of the crowd is looking at the the prices and saying, well, this week you got to pay up for running backs. Maybe you shouldn't pay up for running backs in your tournaments then, because if you're paying down for running backs, then that means you're going to have space in your roster that other people don't have, which is just going to naturally get you onto other plays that other people aren't playing. So that is definitely something that can get you, different sorts of teams. Another strategy there is just to pivot off of highly owned players by using other players who you think have upside at a similar price. So, for example, I think Marvin Jones is going to be the highest owned wide receiver week 1 on DraftKings. There's a couple guys around him, Vincent Jackson, Anquan Bolden, that have scenarios where they do very well. But if you're to pivot off of Marvin Jones, say you go to Anquan Bolden. If Marvin Jones gets hurt in the first quarter, Anquan Bolden's now the starting wide receiver for the Lions, and you're getting all that production against the Colts. That could potentially be huge. Like I said, it's not something that you have to do every time. I think I'm going to have tournament lineups with Marvin Jones in them because I think he's a great play, and I think he lets me unlock value in other places. But I'm going to, also look to pivot off those types of players in certain lineups, and because if someone has 4,700 left and they need a wide receiver, boom, Marvin Jones is the default there. Vincent Jackson or Anquan Bolden, those guys are not the default, so it's going to naturally make their ownership lower. I want to talk briefly about the idea of multi-entering. I kind of referred to it before, where if you're running multiple lineups, you don't need to fade or not play a guy in every single lineup. I prefer to multi-enter smaller buy-in tournaments So if I'm budgeting out $20 this week, for, let's say I'm looking at FanDuel, I'm like, I got $20 um, for tournaments, and what I would probably do with that is make 10 different lineups and enter them all in the $2 tournament. Or, maybe say I've got a smaller group of players that I like. I don't want to diversify that much. I'll make 4 different $5 lineups. Um, there are single entry tournaments as well. So, those are, if you're more of a guy who's looking at it and says, I just want to play one tournament lineup, and I don't want to have to deal with other people putting potentially hundreds, because some of these guys who play a lot of volume will put hundreds of lineups in the same tournament. Like, I don't want to deal with that. Single entry is the way to go. That's fine. I will say, in terms of single entry, what I like to do is actually be even a little bit more contrarian, because since it's single entry, people tend just naturally to play safer lineups in those, because I don't want to throw out my money. But a safe lineup is probably going to get you maybe a cash, maybe not. Maybe, you double your money in it, but I'm not playing a tournament to double my money. I'm playing a tournament to win a large sum of money at the top. So with people being even more chalky, I guess is the term, with people playing the high-owned players even more in these single entry tournaments, it becomes even more beneficial to be a little bit contrarian, and you can really pass a lot of the field if some things go your way. All right, so that's pretty much going to do it for tournaments. I just want to touch briefly on each position and things that you can look at to try and figure out, who's the right play for that week. Who's the guy you want to play in your cash game? Who's the guy you want to play in your tournaments? I'll start with QB. Basically, I like to target QBs who are Vegas favorites in my cash games. I like to target QBs playing bad defenses, and I like to target high-scoring games. I generally don't pay up for elite quarterbacks because the range of scores for quarterbacks isn't as high as it is for other positions. Like, most quarterbacks are going to score somewhere within, the 10 to let's say 30-point range. Whereas on a site like DraftKings, a wide receiver could get shut down the entire game. A very good wide receiver ends up with a 4-point game. Like, that's something that happens. And then sometimes wide receivers, Antonio Brown last year had multiple 40-point games on DraftKings with touchdowns and with those yardage bonuses. So I tend to normally use mid to low range quarterbacks with good matchups, just because I think it allows me to pay up at other spots, and normally I'm pretty comfortable with that. At running back in general, it's just the easiest position to find low-priced options who are relatively safe, because running backs get injured a lot, and even if it's not a season-ending injury, if a guy's hurt and his backup is going to get the work, you can generally rely on that backup pretty comfortably, because running back production is really more about opportunity than talent. If you show me a guy and say this guy's going to get 18 touches this game, I don't care if he's bad. I'm going to play him, because it's a situation where you give that guy 18 touches, like, that's a pretty safe floor. Say maybe 3 of them are catches, that kind of thing. It doesn't matter if he's not that good. He's cheap, and he's giving me a safe floor that I can take advantage of. And I already mentioned before, I don't really like to use game script dependent running backs for my 50-50s and double ups. I prefer to use a running back who would still be involved in the pass game if the team's behind, and would also be involved in the run game if the team's ahead. wide receiver more so than the other positions, I think, is based specifically on the matchup, where you know, specific cornerbacks match up with wide receivers a lot of the time. You know, sometimes they'll just, you know, teams will just line up their cornerbacks wherever. The Seahawks are an example of that most of the time, where Sherman's on one side, the other cornerback, you know, would be on the other side. The slot guy is in the slot, and they don't really change that too much. They don't have Sherman shadow guys as much. So that is one thing to consider, just the cornerback matchups. But the biggest thing is predicting target volume. If you can, with a degree of accuracy, predict target volume, you're going to be able to predict production. Again, we're looking for opportunity more than anything else. Talent plays a huge role, but target volume is huge. At tight end, I think the biggest thing, because you know tight ends generally don't get as many targets as wide receivers do. There's going to be some exceptions there. A guy like Jordan Reed will likely get a lot of targets. You know, Gronk, Gary Barnidge, that sort of thing. But in terms of tight ends, a way to get cheaper guys, I think, and a way just in general, you really want to look at the chances of scoring touchdowns for that guy in that week. So look for favorites, high point totals. Look for guys who get red zone targets, because tight ends rely on touchdowns for their scoring more than wide receivers, just because those targets aren't necessarily as predictable or as frequent. On the defensive side, you can look at point totals and kind of go from there, but I kind of feel like that's an overrated way to do it, because point totals aren't really what drive defensive scoring in fantasy football. It's really more about turnovers and you know, getting pressure on the quarterback. Defensive pressure correlates to turnovers. Basically, when a defense gets pressure on the quarterback, things like sack fumbles happen, things like interceptions happen, and that's really what leads to the defensive scoring in fantasy. So I normally look for defensive pressure, and then O-line pass blocking stats, in order to really decide who I'd want to go with there. And then lastly, on FanDuel, you do have kickers. The biggest thing really is just looking for a high team total. Look at those Vegas odds, see where the team total is. And then what I like to do as the season goes on and this thing, or you know, this stat gets less and less noisy and more potentially predictive, is you can look for red zone scoring percentages for the offense and the defense. And you know, if a team has a high point total, they have a good offense, but their red zone scoring percentage is maybe middle of the pack, that the defense they're playing against doesn't generally give up touchdowns very much. That's a situation where the kicker should theoretically be, you know, kicking a lot of field goals. So those are the kind of things I will look for there. You know, you might be saying here, well, that's great and all, but like, where do I get this information? The Vegas odds are a great place to start. So you're looking at things from the team down. You're not artificially inflating individual projections, you know, with, you know, and then you add them all up, and all of a sudden, you know, you've got 700 receiving yards on the offense. It's like, well, obviously that's not going to happen. So start with the Vegas odds is generally what I do. Sites like Pro Football Reference and Football Outsiders have great stats. Football Outsiders, DVOA for defenses is a stat that you'll hear me quote a lot, and a stat that I use a lot personally. I'll be putting out weekly DFS content in some sort of format, so keep an eye out for that as well. I don't know yet whether it's going to be sort of a shorter podcast or an article that I'm putting out, because I tend to finalize and do most of my research on Saturdays, because I play mostly the Sunday slates. So that makes it a little difficult to get the content to you guys in time to where it's actionable. But I definitely will be trying to do that throughout the year. yeah, I think that's going to do it for me tonight, guys. I appreciate you listening. If you did take the time to listen in, uh, if you are getting into DFS, or if you want to discuss strategies, plays, whatever you want there. You have any questions? You have any ideas that you think are cool ideas or good ideas? Reach out to me either through the site. You can reach out through the Let's Talk Fantasy Football Twitter handle. It's at Let's Talk FF. You can reach out directly to me on Twitter. I'm at nwashington. I love talking about daily fantasy. It's something that I put a lot of time and effort into. So I'm definitely accessible there, and definitely willing to talk about things regarding strategies and anything else. Um, so yeah, thank you guys. We'll be back likely early next week with a podcast of us just kind of like recapping our draft weekend. It might be a little more lighthearted, little lighter on the analysis than usual, because it's going to be all of us sitting in a room together, probably either hungover or having beers or both. I don't know. So just keep an eye out for that. It'll probably be a pretty fun one, and then we'll have our week one preview up midweek next week, so you guys can go through, listen to that, and make sure you get all your lineups set with the right information. Thank you guys again. And second straight terrible close on my part. I was trying to think of something. I got nothing. So I'll see you guys.